In August 1942, deep in the forests outside Leningrad, German commanders were preparing to unleash a beast the world had never seen. This wasn't just a new weapon, it was Hitler's personal obsession, a steel predator meant to tilt the war by sheer force of will. But how did this grand wonder weapon turn into one of the Reich's most humiliating and expensive failures? In this video, you'll hear what German Stab officers preferred to keep off the record for years. We'll pull back the curtain on a high-stakes engineering showdown where the price wasn't only money, but reputations and, at times, the lives of the men who built it. And you'll see how these top-secret machines, designed to be untouchable, began to overheat, break down, and literally burn before they ever reached the enemy. Why did the debut Hitler was betting everything on end in a frantic retreat and abandoned equipment? What embarrassing detail did Tiger crews leave behind, engines running, as they fled from Soviet infantry? And why did a small, crude trophy a German soldier forgot, a pin-up booklet, end up being treated in Moscow as a more revealing prize than a pile of captured guns? We'll trace the story from the triumphant blueprints on the Führer's desk to the captured Tigers hauled to Kubinka for inspection. Stay to the end to see how overconfidence and the chase for superweapons turned these predators into helpless targets, and why the Tiger's biggest secret also became its weakest point. Let's begin. In late August 1942, outside Leningrad, something happened that was supposed to change the course of World War II for good. German commanders were preparing a crushing blow, putting their faith in a new wonder weapon, the Tiger heavy tank. These steel giants were conceived as the ultimate answer on the battlefield, a machine powerful enough to crack fortified defenses almost by itself. But the story of this ambitious project began much earlier, born out of a moment of crisis and bitter disillusionment inside the Third Reich's highest circles. It started with the collapse of a myth. Back in 1941, as Wehrmacht units drove rapidly east, their confidence in German technical superiority was suddenly shaken. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most influential armored warfare thinkers, later recalled with unmistakable bitterness the day his troops captured the first Soviet T-34s. What they saw left officers stunned. The official narrative that had painted the Soviet Union as technologically backward was simply false. In front of them was a tank whose armor, mobility, and firepower outclassed virtually anything Germany had in service at the time. And the implication was terrifying. Once Soviet industry got those tanks into true mass production, the usual German methods, tactics, experience, momentum would no longer be enough. That realization triggered alarm at the top and pushed Hitler to intervene personally in weapons development. On his direct orders, the best engineers from Henschel and Porsche were thrown into a frantic race to build an answer to Soviet steel. The goal wasn't just another tank, it had to be a predator, something so formidable it would intimidate before it even fired a shot. By April 1942, the engineers presented their result, a heavy vehicle with unprecedented armor thickness and a long-range gun built to dominate from a distance. Despite how unfinished the project still was, Hitler couldn't wait to see his predators in action. The Leningrad sector was chosen, where a major assault on the city was planned for the fall of 1942. Early on the morning of August 23, the first 4 production Tigers were hurried onto rail flat cars and sent toward the MGA station. German headquarters was already tasting victory, convinced that the sudden appearance of these supposedly unstoppable machines would be a fatal shock to Leningrad's defenders. But the rush wasn't driven by strategy alone. It was also fueled by a ruthless power struggle behind the scenes between two industrial titans, Ferdinand Porsche and Ernst Henschel. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, it was a clash of philosophies. Porsche, the Führer's favorite, proposed a design that seemed ahead of its time, a tank built around an extraordinarily complex electric transmission. On paper, it looked revolutionary. In war conditions, it proved temperamental, too fragile, too demanding, too unpredictable. Henschel, by contrast, pushed a more conventional approach, and his design ultimately went into production. Yet even this practical option became a hostage to compromise. Trying to satisfy Hitler's ambitions and beat a rival on deadlines, Henschel's engineers produced an overweight giant whose critical components were operating at the edge of what the hardware could physically endure. So the vehicles sent to the front were a triumph on engineering drawings, but dangerously vulnerable in reality. And reality began rewriting the script before their tracks even touched the ground. Soviet commanders, as if sensing what was coming, had no intention of waiting passively. In late August, the Red Army launched the Sinyavino offensive, immediately throwing the Wehrmacht's plans into chaos. Instead of breaking through toward the city, German forces were forced into an emergency defensive posture. In that critical moment, Hitler ordered the new tanks thrown into combat at once, ignoring warnings that the machines were not ready for real conditions. The Tiger's first appearance began as a disaster. Almost as soon as they rolled off the rail cars, 3 of the 4 tanks broke down. 2 suffered catastrophic transmission failures under the strain of their enormous weight. A third overheated so badly that its engine caught fire. The pride of the Reich sat immobilized in the rear, never even reaching the front line. And in that moment, it became clear. The curse of a weapon born in intrigue, rivalry, and a race against time was starting to take effect at the worst possible moment for Germany. Despite the technical embarrassment in the rear, Hitler refused to back down. His obsession with the new toy demanded an immediate result, and field workshops were pushed to the breaking point. In the shortest time possible, the 3 disabled tanks were patched up, rushed back into working order, and sent forward again. German commanders understood the danger. Every hour meant the element of surprise was slipping away, while the Soviet pressure near Sinyavino was only growing. And so the Tigers were committed at last, but under conditions that were close to suicidal. The terrain outside Leningrad was a maze of dense, swampy forest, broken only by narrow clearings and thin access roads. The heavy machines, nearly 60 tons of steel, were caught in a natural trap. Instead of deploying across open ground and using their firepower as intended, the tanks were forced to move single file, tied to the few passable routes. Any attempt to leave the road risked sinking the vehicle into the soft ground, so deep it could swallow the tank up to its turret. General Guderian, watching from the side, didn't hide his anger. He openly criticized the decision to use a strategic asset for a secondary mission on terrain that neutralized everything the Tiger was built for. In his view, sending Tigers into bogs was like using a precision instrument as a sledgehammer, expensive, powerful, and completely misapplied. Soviet artillery crews positioned along the forest corridors understood immediately what this meant. They didn't have to outmaneuver the Tigers, they only had to wait. Anti-tank guns were already sighted on the narrow passages, turning the movement of Germany's new machines into a predictable run through a shooting gallery. In that first attack, not one of the 4 Tigers managed to reach the Red Army's forward positions. The thunder of big guns and the clatter of tracks gave way to the sound of metal dragging and sinking into mud. Under fire, 3 damaged tanks were hauled back toward the rear, using heavy recovery vehicles and the brutal, exhausting work of evacuation teams. But the 4th Tiger became a real problem for the Wehrmacht. Stuck fast in swampy ground within reach of Soviet trenches, it turned into a stationary gun platform, impossible to move, impossible to hide, and increasingly impossible to save. Trapped in no man's land, the 4th Tiger became a symbol of a triumph that never happened. The German crews understood what was at stake. If the Soviets captured this machine intact, the Reich's new claim of invincibility would be exposed almost as soon as it appeared. Under cover of darkness and constant fire, Wehrmacht engineers and technicians worked desperately to strip the immobilized tank of anything valuable. They managed to remove the most sensitive instruments and key pieces of equipment, but moving the steel carcass, nearly 60 tons, out of the glue-like Leningrad soil proved impossible. For Soviet soldiers, the motionless steel cliff in front of them was a mystery. At first, artillery opened up on it, but shells of the usual calibers did little more than scar the armor. It quickly became clear this wasn't just another enemy tank. It was something fundamentally new. And despite German attempts to destroy the abandoned vehicle, or at least render it useless, Soviet scouts began a deliberate hunt for what they now understood as a prize, a captured Tiger. Tension rose with each passing day. German command was furious. The very first combat use of the Tiger had produced not only losses, but something even worse. It had blown the secrecy of the wonder weapon ahead of schedule. The surprise Hitler wanted to unleash in future major battles had been sacrificed to impatience. Just as Guderian had warned, the enemy now didn't simply know the heavy tank existed, they had a chance to examine it up close and start learning where it could be hurt. That disgraceful debut in the forests outside Leningrad was the first serious udar to the Tiger's reputation. The world's thickest armor turned out to be powerless against 2 forces the Reich couldn't control: soldiers defending their own ground and a landscape that punished every mistake. But the real breakthrough for the Red Army came later, when fortune favored them a second time, and the path opened to the most closely guarded secrets of German tank design. The real turning point in this hunt for the Reich's secrets came a few months later, when winter locked the ground around Leningrad in ice. In January 1943, during the fighting to break the siege, luck finally turned against German tank crews for good. On January 16th, Soviet artillery scored a direct hit on a Tiger, crippling it and leaving it unable to move. But the most valuable prize came the very next day. On January 17th, near the workers' settlements, Soviet troops found a second Tiger. The tank was almost undamaged, and incredibly, it was sitting there with its engine running. The crew had abandoned their steel beast in a rush, seized by panic as Red Army units pressed forward. They didn't just fail to blow up the vehicle, they didn't even destroy the paperwork inside. What Soviet soldiers captured was essentially a fresh-off-the-line example: its new technical logbook, a full set of instruments, its weapons, and even the crew's personal belongings. It was an extraordinary moment. A cutting-edge, highly secret enemy weapon had fallen into Soviet hands in near-perfect condition. Under heavy German artillery fire, an attempt to erase the evidence of this humiliation, Soviet recovery teams did what should have been impossible. Risking their lives, they hauled both giants off the battlefield. the trophies were immediately loaded onto special rail platforms and sent under tight guard to Kubinka near Moscow. There, at the country's main proving ground, the Tigers faced a process best compared to a full anatomical autopsy. Soviet engineers and designers worked around the clock. Every part, every armor alloy, every transmission component was examined and documented. And to kill the myth of invincibility once and for all, one of the captured Tigers was placed on the range and fired upon with every relevant weapon in the Soviet inventory. The results were a cold shock for the Wehrmacht. With the right tactics and the right guns, Hitler's wonder weapon could be penetrated. Reports went to Moscow that would reshape Soviet doctrine, changing how Red Army units fought, hunted, and destroyed Germany's heavy tanks from that point forward. The test results at Kubinka stripped the Tiger of its most powerful aura, the myth of mystical invincibility. It was clear now, this was a dangerous enemy, but a knowable one. And yet, despite its humiliating debut in the swamps outside Leningrad, German command had no intention of abandoning its ambitions. Once the worst teething problems were addressed and key mechanisms refined, the Tigers began appearing on other fronts of the war, trying to prove themselves under conditions better suited to their design. In the winter and spring of 1943, they made a strong impression in the fighting around Kharkov. Then, in the summer, they became the Wehrmacht spearhead during Operation Citadel at Kursk. On a narrow section of the front, Germany concentrated 148 Tigers. Even though they made up less than 8% of the total tank force, their impact was outsized. They punched corridors through Soviet defenses, knocking out vehicles at ranges that many Soviet guns struggled to match. But even that level of firepower couldn't change the outcome of the battle. Used in scattered actions, the Tigers were picked off one by one, unable to turn local breakthroughs into a strategic victory. At the same time, Hitler's Iron Menagerie showed up in other theaters as well. In December 1942, Tigers landed in the heat and sand of North Africa. In Tunisia and near Jeddah, they shocked British and American crews, whose tanks could be hit and set ablaze before they ever got close enough to fight back. But geography was merciless to German machinery. In Africa, the Tigers' story ended with the surrender of Axis forces. On Sicily, of the 17 Tigers sent to the island, only one was successfully evacuated. The rest were destroyed by their own crews during the retreat. The Tigers' War continued in Italy and in the forests of Belarus. It took part in one of the Wehrmacht's last successful operations, known as Hubertus, but soon found itself caught under the weight of the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration. By mid-1944, large numbers of these steel giants had been lost for good in the Baltic region and during the retreat back toward Germany's borders. Over time, mechanics and crews learned to tame much of the Tiger's early unreliability, turning it into one of the most dangerous tanks of its era. But its greatness became its curse. Production was slow and extraordinarily expensive, and its sheer weight turned every movement into a logistical nightmare, so heavy that even rail flat cars sometimes failed under it. Chronic spare parts shortages and the complexity of maintenance pushed Germany toward a more scalable choice, the Panther. In the end, the Reich was forced to admit a brutal truth. No war could be won on miracle machines alone, no matter how terrifying they looked on the battlefield. And so the sun set on one of the Third Reich's most ambitious and most contradictory projects. In the end, the Tiger's fate became a clear lesson from a war of entire systems. Victory doesn't belong to the single perfect machine, but to the balance between power and mass production. Hitler, blinded by the idea of superweapons, realized too late that while his factories were spending thousands of man-hours refining every part of one heavy tank, Soviet industry was turning out dozens of reliable, combat-proven T-34s. The Tiger's impact on military thinking was enormous. Its very appearance forced designers on both sides to rethink armor and firepower, accelerating tank development by years. But after Soviet specialists examined the captured examples, first near Leningrad, then in Kubinka, one conclusion became unavoidable. The Tiger was not a wonder weapon. It was a formidable, extremely expensive, high-maintenance machine that, for all its strength, could not overcome harsh climate, unforgiving terrain, or the hard resolve of people defending their homeland. Even later, more intimidating versions, like the King Tiger, couldn't reverse the trend. Hitler kept chasing new miracle weapons to the very end, convinced they might save his regime. Reality was merciless. Invincible in theory, Germany's big cats increasingly ended up abandoned in ditches, out of fuel, broken down, or simply impossible to recover, turning into roadside monuments to imperial ambition that never became reality. The Tiger's story began in the swamps outside Leningrad, with absurd breakdowns and equipment left behind. It ended in the ruins of Berlin, where the last of these giants burned out on the streets of a defeated capital. Today, the few that survived the war sit in museums around the world. They no longer inspire fear. They stand as silent reminders that even the strongest steel is powerless when it's forged in the service of a wrong cause.